Welcome to the Bill Walton Show, featuring conversations with leaders, entrepreneurs, artists, and thinkers. Fresh perspectives on money, culture, politics, and human flourishing. Interesting people, interesting things.
I think this is what we want to do to raise people's consciousness, to use that bad old 1960s term.
Yes.
About what's at stake in that boring old Department of Labor, which is not boring at all. It's coming from your wife, your children, and your dogs.
Don't touch my dog.
Don't touch my dogs. Okay, so let me kick this off.
Go ahead.
Welcome to the Bill Walton Show. I'm Bill Walton. Today, we're talking about the U.S. Department of Labor, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the National Labor Relations Board, and the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation. These may sound like boring agencies. They did to me before I started studying them. But what you learn about them is that Congress has granted them a stunning amount of power to regulate virtually every aspect of the American workplace. These agencies administer and enforce more than 180 federal laws and thousands of federal regulations, which rule over 10 million employers and over 150 million workers. Under the Biden administration, the whole of government has been weaponized to promote a so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda that, in fact, wants to bring about just the opposite of what these words mean. And no department has been more weaponized to promote this agenda than labor. This is the most assertive, left-wing social engineering and anti-family agenda in America's history. And that one that will radically ratchet up regulatory costs on small businesses and, in reality, all productive industry in the United States. And labor is also pushing a radical so-called ESG investment agenda that will dramatically reduce investment returns for American pensioners. There's probably no one that I can think of that is better equipped to explain all this and what we can do about it than my old friend, the very Honorable Patrick Pizzella, who served for 3 years as our Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Labor and as acting secretary for several months in 2019. Pat's also served as a member and chairman of the Federal Labor Relations Authority and in the Department of Education as Deputy Undersecretary for Management. In my work with him, I've come to appreciate that in my experience, no one has a better grasp of both the big picture and the minutia of the labor laws and regulations than Pat. And Pat has a new gig, and as you might see from the fact he's not wearing a suit, Pat is Mayor Pro Tem of Pinehurst, North Carolina. So Pat, welcome. Good to talk with you again.
It's a delightful, Bill, to see you. And as we say here in Pinehurst, it's a beautiful day in Pinehurst. It's
what time's your tea time?
Well, I'm hoping we can get through this in time for me to make it, but we're very flexible down here with tea times. 40 golf courses in the county.
So where do you want to begin? You seem to know more about the Department of Labor than anyone I know. How did all this get started?
Well, okay. I actually have spent, in the 21st century alone, I spent 11 years at the Department of Labor. I was Assistant Secretary under Elaine Chao for Administration and Management during the Bush administration. I spent 3 years as Deputy Secretary of Labor. And in the interim, I spent 4 years as a member and then acting chairman of the Federal Labor Relations Authority. So I've really spent a lot of time in the labor space, as people like to say in Washington. The irony of the Department of Labor is that it was created and authorized on the very last day that President Taft was in office. As he was leaving in March of 1913, he signed the legislation. And he reluctantly signed it. He really criticized the creation of another government agency and all, but he felt it was best to go ahead and sign it, and hopefully his.
Well, he was busy, wasn't he? Also creating the federal income tax and the Federal Reserve Board during that
Well,
time. I mean, they were
he was-
productive in creating things that have begun to wreck the country.
Well, I don't know. I didn't go into that history as much as I went into his connection with the Department of
Okay,
Labor.
we'll stick with labor, but it's
So
there was a
over
lot
the
of bad stuff going on in the 19-teens.
Yes. Well, that's a whole nother show. But so it emerged as a department, and over the time it sort of gathered like a rolling stone and gathered more moss there, and it'd be part of it. OSHA eventually joined it, that 4-letter word, Occupational Safety and Health. MSHA, which oversaw the safety in the mines. The Wage and Hour Administration, which administered the Fair Labor Standards Act. The Employment Security Administration, Employment Benefit Security Administration, which oversees the ERISA law and pensions. So it's a collection of a lot of these agencies. Its most famous leader, head, was, of course, Frances Perkins, the first female member of her president's cabinet, and she served 13 years under FDR as Secretary of Labor. Thus, her name is on the headquarters building of the department right now, Frances Perkins Building. As time evolved and the bureaucracy somewhat grew, shall we say,
But Pat,
it got
let
into people's
Pat,
lives more and more.
let me jump in though. So I joked about the early 19-teens, but in reality, it was in a time when the progressives in America realized a lot of their ambitions. And Frances Perkins was, as I recollect, a famous progressive.
Yeah.
And so we talk about the progressive agenda. It's been over 100 years in the works, and the seeds of this were right here. And the theory behind creating the Department of Labor was that businesses were evil and exploiting workers, and that people had the right to unionize, and they were being blocked from this, and therefore this created this incredible divide between employers and employees, which has only grown worse over the last 100 years. Yeah,
well, the New Deal is where the department really started to emerge as a big player, and as sort of in the relation to organized labor. I've often said that it's the Department of Labor, not the Department of Organized Labor, though after the passage of the Wagner Act and going forward from then, it really became a department that organized labor saw as sort of their fiefdom to a degree. And it wasn't until after World War II, with the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act, that some of the excesses of the FDR era Department of Labor were sort of rattled in a bit, and you saw the establishment of the right of states to enact right to work laws, and you saw some other restraints regarding boycotts and all that were reaction right after World War II to some of the troubled times between the original passage of the National Labor Relations Act and the Taft-Hartley Act. And then after the Taft-Hartley Act, the only other significant change to labor law in this country was in 1959, when they adopted what was known as the Landrum-Griffin Act, which ironically, some of the key movers and shakers in creating that were Bobby Kennedy, who was a staff director on the Senator McClellan of Arkansas's committee, and Senator John Kennedy. This bill, Landrum-Griffin, created what's known as the Labor Management Reporting and Disclosure Act, which stressed union democracy and put some power in the hands of union members to have some rights to be able to speak up for themselves and have some transparency to the way their unions were treating them. But since that time, 1959, 1960, there's been no major change at all to our federal labor laws. And though there have been attempts, and so here we are today with the same basic laws that we've been operating under since the 50s, though the economy has changed, because in 1955, the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, and the CIO, the Congressional, Industrial Organization, they merged into one big super union. And from that moment on, there has been a steady decline, not a trend, a steady decline in the amount of workers in the private sector who are represented by labor unions. And it's now down to about 5%. When they merged, it was about 35%.
Well, what's your assessment of that? I mean, because, the good intentions created these laws, protect workers. In many cases, probably a good idea, but in some cases, maybe not so good. And then as time goes on, what is a good idea then may be a terrible idea now, because you say the laws, we haven't passed many laws, but we've brought about tens of thousands of regulations since then. So it's not just legislation, but it's ruled by the administrative state. And I can't think of a more aggressive ruler than the Department of Labor.
Yes. Well, and that's, you've hit sort of on the nub of the problem. Much of what's coming out of the Department of Labor now are these rules changes, or their interpretation of statutes and their interpretation of their authority through the administrative state to place guidance.
Same sort of thing we're seeing out of the EPA and the other
Yes.
alphabet soup agencies.
Yes. And let's take a present day example. The new administration under Secretary Walsh decided to issue what's called an emergency temporary standard regarding COVID in the workplace. And they wanted to require all workers to have a COVID vaccine. And we in the under Secretary Scalia, the unions twice took the secretary to court to ask that he be required to issue this temporary standard. He fought it in court and he won. Biden people come in and they say, okay, we're going to push this. They pushed it. They finally got it out. And it went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, you don't have the right to do that, Department of Labor. So they spared the entire private sector workforce out there from having to have this imposed on them. So excellent example of the administrative state attempting to impose something on all of American businesses. And they were saved by the Supreme Court. And so they didn't get away with that. But that's probably the most blatant attempt to have such a wide landscape over the American workforce that one has seen in some time. Thankfully, they failed.
Well, this is the Bill Walton Show, and I'm talking with as I put it, the very honorable Patrick Pizzella, who was a big deal in the Department of Labor for years, talking about that department. And the question I've got for Pat is, what's the Department of Labor doing that it shouldn't be doing? And how much worse has it gotten since Biden people have come in? My impression, as I said at the outset, is that they're moving apace to do a lot of stuff, which I think is quite damaging.
Well, I mentioned a little bit ago, they tried, of course, to impose their COVID-19 vaccination standards on the entire workforce. And they are attempting, which I think is very damaging. They're getting closer, I think, to attempting to put new rules in place regarding independent contractors, or better known as the gig economy, which is a growing segment of our economy. Depending on who you talk to, could be anywhere from 15 to 20% of the workforce is involved in the gig economy. Many people who have two jobs, they may have one job where they're an employee of a company, and they may have had another job where they're an independent contractor. They may, drive for Uber, or they may be a Santa Claus at a shopping mall during the winter, at Christmas season. Those are gig jobs. They're part-time, and they are set up to help the individual's schedule and work situation. But organized labor does not like the gig economy, because they find it obviously very challenging to organize workers who are very independent, as technically they are.
And how does organized labor, you pointed out earlier, organized labor has fallen down to a very, very low number relative to what it used to be. How do they still have this kind of clout?
Well, they are financially a very well-off operation. They collect billions of dollars a year in dues. And they obviously have a presence in Washington, D.C., as well as, of course, in every state to a degree. So politics is a big part of what organized labor does, because the workforce the percentage of the workforce that they've organized has continually been shrinking, but their coffers are, still have some money in them, unless they've had some deposits in the Silicon Valley Bank.
Well, they did, and they're okay because
Okay.
they've been bailed out. I mean, that's where you want to put your money if you want to keep it really safe, is put it in a very progressive, woke financial institution. You're sure to be bailed out by the feds. But don't put your money in East Palestine or East Palestine National Bank, because you will be ignored by the feds.
So
okay, a little editorial in there, but Pat, so what happened with it? I think we need to get into this gig economy, independent contractor employee thing a little bit more, because I've had several businesses where the distinction between independent contractor and employee was blurred. Well, it's hard to figure it out. The IRS has got some rules, the labor's got some rules. I'm sure other agencies do. But as an entrepreneur, as an employer, which I was, if you put somebody in a payroll, there's a tremendous burden there in terms of withholding and benefits and regulation and paper and things like that. If on the other hand, you say somebody, they want to work 10 hours a week and they want to go drive a car for you or drive, your taxi service, they're an independent contractor, then your only relationship is 1099.
Right.
So you work X number of hours, you do a certain number of things, and you get a check and you file your own tax return, and it's quite simple. Making people employees imposes an incredible burden on both the employer and the employee.
Yes, you described it very well. And what's emerged in the 21st century for sure is these new business models operated on platforms, many of them in the technology space, but some of them very old that we don't even think about, of the part-time worker. And that is a worker part-time largely on their own decision. Maybe their home life, their childcare responsibilities require them to only work, or allow them to only work so many hours a day or a week, so they can handle other responsibilities they have. And obviously the well-known ones are the Uber and the Lyft and the delivery type services.
They don't want to be employees. They want to
no,
be
they actually want to be independent, because they can decide, when can I drive that car? Or if you, in some cases, also in franchise operations, people they can't be full-time employees.
Pat, let me go big picture on you here. $5 word alert, voluntary exchange. It's where you get to make a contract with me. You think it's in your benefit. I think it's in my benefit. It's just between the two of us. And it treats us like you're grown up. You can discern what your own interest is, and you enter into the relationship, or you don't.
Right.
It seems like everything in the labor laws have done immense damage to that voluntary relationship, and it's incredibly parental and assertive and punitive. And they just assume that employees are children that can't negotiate on their own behalf, and they've got to impose all these regs on employers. And it has an incredible dead weight on the economy and economic activity. I mean, if you want to look at reasons for lower productivity, I blame the Labor Department. And I'm going to hold you accountable for it, for not fixing it while you were there.
I know you will. Well, a little bit of history. There is somewhat of a little bit of a gray area between the independent contractor and the full-time employee, and how people are classified. So misclassification does occur from time to time. But what emerged with these new platform companies and business models in the last 20 years or so was a thriving economic model. And
With
At some
independent,
point,
with independent contractors at the heart of it.
yes, and
Okay.
it was national. But some people might suggest that it got its birth in California. What happened is it became so successful. Organized labor said, we've got to put a stop to this. And we've got to force these independent contractors to be employees, okay? Because then we've got a shot at them, at organizing them. So the legislature in California passed a bill, famous bill now known as AB 5. And there was a backlash. And the private sector went out and got a repeal effort on the ballot in California of all the states. And it was on the ballot in November of 2020. And this is Joe Biden was carrying the state by I don't know how many points, 20 points. His running mate was from California. And AB 5, the voters there overwhelmingly repealed that law that the legislature had passed, because they found out it was affecting them. It was affecting journalists who aren't employees anymore. They're independent journalists, and they get paid by the click of the word.
It's overwhelmingly popular to let people remain independent contractors if they so choose.
And the fallout from that was organized labor thought other states were going to pass other bills similar to what California did. What happened is after they saw that vote in California, it's really slowed down elsewhere. So what they have turned to is the U.S. Department of Labor to put a rule in place that makes it more difficult to allow people to be classified as independent contractors. And that is what they're in the process of doing.
So they found a way to
end up
not
in
make
court.
it a law. It's another rule, which is not subject to the popular vote.
Correct. You are correct.
Great. Well done, guys.
Before we left the Department of Labor, Secretary Scalia, we issued a rule that brought clarification and independence to independent contractors. The new administration has a different view of that, and we'll see how that plays out in court.
Well, I've weighed in on where I come out on it, but so still, let's stick with this is Bill Walton, and we're talking with Pat Pizzella, who's great knowledge of labor and labor laws and the regulations in this country. Is an invaluable asset to our side. But he still hasn't answered my question. Is Pat, what is labor doing that it shouldn't be doing? If you were secretary with no constraints, really, just to do the right thing, to make the economy, to free up labor, to still protect people where they need to be protected, but make the market for labor more efficient and more productive, what would you do?
Well, the first thing is, of course, to do no harm, which means not passing regulations that place a burden on entrepreneurs and job creators, which is what we very much tried to do during the Trump administration, and we're quite successful at rescinding some very onerous regulations from the Obama era and putting in some ones in place that provided more freedom to workers. Secondly, one of the things that the department really needs to do is to get a better handle on what I'll call the fraud that exists in the unemployment insurance programs that are administered in the 50 states. During the COVID-19 era, there was a big rush to push money out the door, just push it out the door. And despite calls from some folks at the Department of Labor, including the secretary at the time, that we've got to be more careful. We've got to have some more criteria before this money goes out the door. The rush to get that money out the door, you can go to the Inspector General website at the Department of Labor, and it's a long, long list of the problems and the fraud and the money they're trying to now collect back.
Doesn't that number mount up to the hundreds of billions of dollars?
I'm not sure if it's hundreds of billions, but it's really close to 100 billion.
Really close to 100 billion.
Yeah. It was, and they're not finished counting, and they're not finished sorting it out, and eventually they will. So do no harm. Tackle the fraud and the mispayments and so forth that go out. And in general, look where the department has overextended itself beyond what really was the intent of Congress when they created such programs. Because there's a lot of ways to pull back this overreach. Because once government starts down that path, they just keep going down that path, unless you could grab the reins and say, whoa, and then try to pull back the administrative state. I'm optimistic that the courts, particularly as we look at the Supreme Court's actions, as I mentioned earlier in that COVID-19 issue with the Department of Labor, the courts are sending a message to the regulatory agencies. You better have some real clear authority from the United States Congress before you start promulgating regulations that are going to impact the American people.
So we touched on this, and I wanted to probe. Union membership is falling in the private sector, but I think there's 6 or 7 or 8 million union employees in the United States. And now I think fully 5 million of those are public sector union employees,
Yeah.
working for state and local government, federal government. And of those, 60, 50, 60, 70% are teachers. And so you've got the public employees really driving this. Was
Yeah.
labor involved in that? Is that
Now,
something?
the way the federal labor laws are set up, the federal government has really no say in state and local employees. That is determined state by state. The federal labor laws deal with the private sector employees, not the public sector employees. There's a separate law for federal employees, but that's much sort of a smaller universe than what's going on in 50 states.
Well, I have a point of view. I don't think public sector employees should be unionized. They've got a total conflict of interest.
Well, that's Franklin Delano Roosevelt felt that way. George Meany felt that way. And the public employee unions are a relatively new phenomenon.
Except that John Kennedy signed it into law.
Well, I'll tell you, very interesting. It wasn't a law; it was an executive order. And if you read it closely, Bill,
who needs laws when you have a pen?
I understand, but if you read it closely, there is a law now. It was signed by Jimmy Carter. But if you read it closely, the Kennedy executive order, the ironic thing about it is it's often referred to as the green light for collective bargaining in the federal workforce. And to a degree it is, but there are 2 words missing from John F. Kennedy's executive order. Those words are collective bargaining. So even he, I think, at that point was a little reluctant to put the word collective bargaining next to a federal employee, because he was the chief executive at that time. So
well, anyway, we have it, and
we have it.
I mentioned the ESG. You've done some work on that, and
Yes.
Labor's now pushing ESG, and which stands for environmental, social, and governance. And nobody knows exactly what those words mean, which is part of the problem with ESG investing. Once you amplify, what's your take on this?
Well, before there was ESG, there was something called ETI, economically targeted investments.
Okay.
And this was something really created during the Clinton administration under Secretary Reich. And they were gung-ho to get their hands on pension assets, pension money that they viewed as sitting there right for being allocated to whatever cause or economically targeted investment they thought was a good idea. And this was all union money, basically. And the unions officials also wanted to get their hands on it. The law placed some constraints around their ability to do that. There are certain things like fiduciary responsibility that's required of pension asset managers and so forth. Well, Reich issued what was then called an interpretive bulletin. You'll like this, Bill. Again, no notice and comment, no input from the citizens. It's interpretive, his interpretation in 1994.
It's
And he was
Washington's
beginning,
favorite way to do things, Pat. You know
yes,
that. I mean, that's the,
and he was beginning to put in place something called a clearinghouse so that this clearinghouse could decide which of these economically targeted investments are really the right ones.
who ran the clearinghouse?
Well, here's what
Reich?
happened.
Reich?
Something happened to intervene with the whole plan.
Yeah.
The 1994 election, and Newt Gingrich took over the House, and the Republicans took over the Senate. And soon after that, Chris Cox, a young congressman from California, and Jim Saxton, a congressman from New Jersey, held a hearing on this very topic. And lo and behold, after that hearing, the clearinghouse went away, and the Clinton administration and all sort of pulled back from that, but their interpretive bulletin was out there. I joined the Department of Labor in 2001. In 2006, some folks brought to our attention, the Secretary Chow's attention, really, this interpretive bulletin. So we looked at it, and we could see what the problem was. You're basically saying to folks, hey, go ahead. We won't pay too much attention to what you do. So we, at her direction, we drafted up our own interpretive bulletin. And so we changed the paradigm there as to, and reminded people of their fiduciary responsibilities. Well, it got put in place, and it stayed there until the second term of the Obama administration, where some people went to Secretary Perez, and it was reported in the paper, and they told him that the interpretive bulletin issued by Secretary Chow has placed a chilling effect on pension managers who would like to do something with these assets that they have some say over and use them. By that time, ESG was just emerging, but so they issued their own interpretive bulletin, revising ours.
Who's they? Who's they?
Perez, Secretary Perez.
Okay, he's great. He later went on to head the DNC.
Yes.
Okay.
So you're
a great bipartisan guy.
Absolutely. I'm following your administrative state nightmare that you laid out. It's true. So then
It's worse than
we came back in, and Secretary Scalia, when he arrived, made a determination. We need to sort of stop this ping pong. Let's go out with our rule and get notice and comment from people, and it'll have some more durability. It took some time. We put it out. It was a good rule. And it really reminded pension managers and the asset managers that they had a fiduciary responsibility to those funds that they're administering on behalf of the pensioners. We got it in there. It was in for a while. And when Biden's folks come in, they said, oh, no, we got to pull that back.
Well, but to put a fine point on it, fiduciary responsibility, prudent man rule means basically you do with your money what a prudent man would do, or prudent, right, I guess now person. Sure. And that is you put it where it will get the highest return.
Correct.
And fast forward to ESG investing, environment being the big one there, which is climate change. And it's utterly clear that that's not where you get the highest return. The only way climate investment gets a high return is through government subsidies. Right. And there's trillions of dollars in the bills passed in the last year aimed at climate subsidies. And most of them went to Al Gore and their friends and all the people in the form of tax returns and favorable financing for stuff they want to do. So this is still targeting investing, but now it's got a sharper focus on climate.
Absolutely right. And yet when this concept first emerged, that was even before I think Al Gore created the internet. That's how long ago it was. But at any rate,
he was busy in 1994 or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At any rate,
or 86.
This issue has now gotten quite a lot of attention, partially for what you said, that as truly financial minds look at the numbers, the ESG investments have not been performing as well as your regular investments. You've seen companies like Vanguard back off from their ESG advocacy on from the Net Zero Coalition, and you see lawsuits filed by attorney generals. You've seen states take the initiative to say, hey, wait a minute, if you're going to be using some of our state pension money assets, you've got to pick assets that are going to produce some real financial returns, and not, investing in the Amazon rainforest because you think it's a swell idea. And so that's this will play out both ironically, in the election cycle, I think, because more and more people are becoming attuned to this because it's their pension money. Most people don't pay attention. Bill, you're a known successful investor. You know how to manage money and all, but most of the people who put money into pensions, they put it there on the theory that I can trust these folks. That's
somebody in the investment firm is going to act on the prudent man theory and invest the money to get the highest returns. Just to weigh in just a little bit, this highest return thing is very, very subtle, because you can argue, well, climate investing's got a good return. Well, it's got a good return because of massive subsidies. Without the subsidies, it's significantly not a good return. It's a negative return. So you've got this circularity where you've got government subsidies going in to make it a good return, but it's never the marketplace that's making the deciding.
Yeah, and sound investments over time. Asset managers know what's a sound investment.
Yeah.
And sometimes these new ideas, it's like the hula hoop of the moment. Everybody wants the hula hoop, and then a year later, nobody's buying hula hoops.
Well, and the other thing for our investment, for the people who don't know what exactly this works, just look at one thing. Look at the fee that's on the fund, because my old creative buddies on Wall Street figured out you slap ESG on something, it seems socially good, social purpose, and you can get 75 basis points instead of 10 basis points to manage it. So the fees are much, much higher if you're an ESG fund.
Obviously, you know this business better than most. And I think the more sunlight brought on this by podcasts like yours,
what we're doing,
op-eds that are written in many newspapers, it's percolating people's minds, because a lot of people have pension money that's being managed by someone they don't know, and they have a reason to be concerned. So I think this is going to play out in the courts and in the election cycle.
So
ESG issue.
We've got a few minutes left. Again, I keep getting back to Chairman Pat or Secretary Patrick Pizzella running the next Department of Labor under our next Republican president. What are the top three things you do to bring about good change at labor?
Boy, well, not
to put you on a spot.
First thing I would do would be to wake up from that dream, Bill. But my only real interest is running the transition next time. But I do think
you have to do more than that, Pat.
The Department of Labor, the golf down here is great, Bill. The Department of Labor is really, it's a regulatory machine that needs to be reined in many cases. And that has to be priority one. Without getting regulation specific, it's a target-rich environment.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing is to, I would say, change the paradigm a bit from going back to being a Department of Labor and not a Department of Organized Labor.
Mm-hmm.
So that the focus is on our tremendous workforce, of which 95% of the private sector are not members of organized labor. But in the same breath, you're respectful for those who are members because they're part of the workforce. And I would say the third thing gets back to the fundamentals of managing the department. It has grown more than it needs to grow. Just in these few years, when we left, we had a budget of $13 billion or so. They're now asking for $15 billion. When we left, we had about 13,000 employees. They're asking in their new budget, the Department of Labor, for 17,000. So I really think those are the three things that buckets that I would look at.
What are those 4,000 new people going to do?
Well, Bill, they're going to go right in some of your favorite regulations if they get the chance. I thought as we're closing, I thought I'd share a little historical note with you about the department. Of the 12 secretaries of labor who were appointed by Democratic presidents in the entire history of the department, there's only been one secretary of labor who served a shorter period of time than Secretary Walsh, who recently left the department to go work on behalf of the National Hockey League retirees. And that person was Arthur Goldberg, who left to go on the Supreme Court when Jack Kennedy appointed him to the Supreme Court. So obviously there's going to be a new Secretary of Labor. There'll be some new hearings, and there'll be a chance to a lot of these issues to be explored before a Senate confirmation process.
Well, I as usual, you've edified me, Pat. You've been doing that since I got involved in this politics and policy world. I appreciate it. I guess you and I got to know each other first when Ed Meese brought it together.
Ed Meese introduced us, yeah.
Conservative Action Project. Well, we're still traipsing along there. I think we're making some progress, not nearly enough. So Pat, thanks so much. Pat Pizzella, great guy. And I really feel, I see that sun dappling in on your sweater.
Yeah.
I feel like I really got to get you out to the golf course.
Come on down to Pinehurst. It's a beautiful day down here.
Yeah,
and I've enjoyed this very much, Bill. It's good to see you. And just talking with you brings back a lot of fond memories.
Yeah. Well, come on back to Washington. We'll do some good together. So this has been the Bill Walton Show with Pat Pizzella, and we've been talking about the Labor Department of, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I hope you learned something about labor, because it's one of those boring sounding agencies, which we really need to watch because it's doing stuff we don't like. As always, you can find our show on all the major podcast platforms, on Rumble, YouTube. We're on Substack. We're also on CPAC now on Monday nights. And please send us your comments on Substack or on our website, thebillwaltonshow.com. Pay a lot of attention to what you'd like us to cover and what to do in upcoming shows. So anyway, thanks for being involved, and we'll be talking soon.
Right.
I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Want more? Click the subscribe button or head over to thebillwaltonshow.com to choose from over 100 episodes. You can also learn more about our guest on our Interesting People page. And send us your comments. We read every one, and your thoughts help us guide the show. If it's easier for you to listen, check out our podcast page and subscribe there. In return, we'll keep you informed about what's true, what's right, and what's next. Thanks for joining.